Hongqi is more than just a luxury car brand from China. It's a red flag on the hood, a symbol of national pride and ambition. Over the past 60 years, the brand has gone from building Soviet-inspired trucks to creating world-class luxury vehicles. In this video, we'll explore how Hongqi became a legend, born from China's political and economic engine, and how it rose to claim its place on the global stage. Our story begins back in the years of the Second World War. The experience of that conflict made it painfully clear. The era of cavalry and horse-drawn carts was over, and modern armies could no longer function without proper logistics and a reliable fleet of trucks. The Soviet Union understood this well. The industrialization they had managed to carry out before the war would have been unthinkable without a capable and dependable workhorse truck. Mao Zedong, the leader of the newly founded People's Republic of China, understood it too. But post-war China, devastated first by Japanese occupation and then by years of civil war, had neither the factories nor the expertise to produce vehicles of its own. At the same time, the need for trucks was growing by the day. That's where the USSR came in. As a political and ideological ally, the Soviet Union had both the experience and the willingness to help. In December 1949, during a visit to Moscow, Chairman Mao personally toured the ZIS truck plant. Not long after, negotiations began about Soviet assistance in building an automobile factory on Chinese soil. It would take nearly 2 years to work out all the details. But in April 1951, China's Ministry of Heavy Industry officially approved the project to construct a truck factory. 2 more years passed, and finally, in a ceremonial event, the foundation stone of the future plant was laid in the city of Changchun in Jilin province. The location was carefully chosen. During the war, Changchun had hosted a major garrison of the Japanese Kwantung Army, so parts of the needed infrastructure were already in place. Back at the ZIS plant in Moscow, a special department was set up to lead the project. Working alongside NAMI and other Soviet organizations, they began developing the master plan for the Chinese factory. The goal was ambitious: to build a full-cycle production facility capable of turning out 30,000 trucks per year. Construction work in China began in November 1953. True to Soviet tradition, it was declared a nationwide effort. Much of the labor came from the engineering corps of the Chinese army. Meanwhile, Soviet engineers supervised the process and provided technical leadership. While the factory was still rising out of the ground, Soviet enterprises were busy manufacturing the necessary tooling and equipment for their Chinese comrades. In total, the USSR supplied more than 80% of the required machinery, including 4,322 advanced metalworking machines, along with documentation already translated into Chinese. As the buildings went up, training programs began. Soviet specialists gave lectures, published manuals and technical articles, and helped train Chinese workers both on-site and during internships in the USSR. Finally, on July 13, 1956, the assembly line was tested for the first time. That day, the very first batch of 12 trucks rolled out of the brand new factory. The vehicle was named Jiefang, which means liberation, a name rich in symbolism. For the first time in history, China could produce trucks without relying on foreign imports. The factory itself became known as First Automotive Works, or simply FAW. As for the Jiefang CA-10, it was essentially a direct copy of the Soviet ZIS 150. It featured a 90-horsepower gasoline engine and a 4-ton payload capacity. Production continued all the way until 1986, with a total of 1.28 million units built. Such was the importance of this vehicle to China's modernization that the Jiefang CA-10 was even featured on the 1 fen banknote, a national symbol of progress through industrial power. But trucks weren't the whole story. In 1955, once again by direct order of Mao Zedong, China launched the development of not one, but two passenger cars. This time, the task was entrusted primarily to local Chinese engineers, although Soviet advisors continued to support the effort. The result was the FAW Dongfeng CA-71, the first Chinese-designed passenger car. Of course, even a quick glance reveals its resemblance to the Soviet Volga, and especially to the French Simca Vedette. This car was never meant for mass production. It was a propaganda project from the very beginning, a symbol of progress rather than a product. Only 20 to 30 units were ever built, and all of them ended up in government hands. Private car ownership in China at the time was even more restricted than in the Soviet Union. Yes, in the USSR, cars were hard to get. People waited in line for 5, sometimes even 10 years. But at least they had the chance to buy one. In China, the system worked differently. Its political model simply didn't allow for mass private ownership of cars. A car was not just a luxury. It was something most people couldn't even dream of. To buy one, you needed official approval or access to a distribution channel through the military, a government agency, or a state-owned company. But while the Dongfeng CA-71, though clearly a political statement, was still promoted as a car for the people, the second model developed by FAW's design department was intended from the very beginning for the party elite. The idea of selling it to private citizens wasn't even considered. And here comes an interesting twist. FAW's leadership decided to create a completely new luxury brand, separate in name and identity from the main manufacturer. Something akin to what Toyota did with Lexus or Honda with Acura. They gave this brand a fitting name, Hongqi, which means red banner. But unlike Lexus, Acura, or even the American Imperial, Hongqi wasn't created for market competition. It was a super luxury vehicle, yet not in the Western consumer sense, but in a symbolic and political context. The first prototypes of the future limousine appeared in 1958. Naturally, the design showed clear influence from both Soviet and American cars of the era. But it also showed that Chinese designers weren't just blindly copying. They were making an effort to bring something of their own into the look and presence of the vehicle. Of course, a car of this stature needed an appropriate engine. But here, FAW hit a roadblock. It would have been logical to borrow, or at least license, a Soviet engine and gearbox. After all, the Soviets had suitable powertrains they used in their own state limousines. And while the USSR was happy to share technical documentation for trucks, they were far less generous when it came to their government limousines. These vehicles were considered elite and classified, with even internal access within the USSR restricted. Attempts to source components from Eastern Bloc allies like Poland, Czechoslovakia, or Hungary also failed, for the simple reason that they didn't have such engines or transmissions to begin with. As for China's own engineering base, it wasn't ready for a homegrown V8 yet. That left only one realistic option: American engines and gearboxes. It may sound ironic, but in the 1950s, China still had a significant number of American cars, many left over from the Kuomintang era, Japanese occupation, or donated by international missions. Chinese engineers had seen firsthand how reliable and advanced American powertrains were. And for a prestige vehicle like the Hongqi, they were the ideal fit. So under the hood of China's first state limousine went a Chrysler FIV8 and a Chrysler automatic transmission. Crucially, the decision to use American components in 1958 had nothing to do with politics. It was a pragmatic choice, driven by engineering needs. China needed a limousine that worked flawlessly and reliably for parades, ceremonies, and international appearances. They used what they could get their hands on, and that happened to be the best tech available. It's important to understand the Hongqi was never just a Soviet-inspired or anti-bourgeois project. It was about crafting a new Chinese vision of luxury, even if it meant building it with imperialist parts. The final design of the car took shape in 1959 with the production version of the Hongqi, which received the designation CA-72. The vehicle turned out to be appropriately massive, as expected from a state limousine. As originally intended, all production cars were allocated exclusively to high-ranking officials. The CA-72 fulfilled its ideological and propaganda role perfectly. It was imposing, luxurious, and unmistakably authoritative. The model was produced in small series until 1967, with a total of 203 units built, 201 limousines, and just 2 parade convertibles. The updated limousine, designated Hongqi CA-770, was unveiled a year earlier in 1966. Technically, the car remained identical to its predecessor. The changes were primarily aesthetic. The vehicle became slightly lower and longer, and the interior trim was elevated to a truly luxurious level. This model later became so iconic that it is often referred to as the first Chinese car or the national car. It wasn't the first, of course, but the second title holds some truth. The CA-770 was used by the entire Chinese leadership, appeared in Western media, and was widely covered in Chinese press as well. Its image became inseparable from Chinese politics, which is why it may indeed be called the national car. In addition to the limousine and parade convertible, the lineup expanded with a shorter sedan used by security services and lower-ranking officials not entitled to a full limousine. For the first time, an armored version of the limousine was also introduced. Hongqi continued building it for over 3 decades with only minor updates. Interestingly, in the 1970s, they developed prototypes with a more modern design, but these never reached production. Visually, they resembled the Soviet Gaz-14 Chaika, which in turn drew inspiration from American cars. Unlike the newer prototypes, the original Hongqi CA-770, a product of the Great Leap Forward era, symbolized the eternal values of the Chinese Revolution. Changes in China's political landscape began in 1976, after the nation's leader Mao passed away.
The International.
By that time, the neighboring communist USSR was producing over 1 million passenger cars a year, while it was still difficult for ordinary Soviet citizens to purchase one. The hardships were nothing compared to the situation in China, where, as mentioned earlier, a private individual simply couldn't own a passenger car, even in theory. However, China gradually began to shift its industrial policy. In December 1978, a plenary session of the Communist Party's Central Committee announced that the country was taking a new course toward a market economy. Soon, the once tightly closed nation began attracting Western investors. Though flooded in might be an exaggeration, it would be more accurate to say they cautiously began testing the waters. Even within FAW, the winds of change were felt. In 1980, the company built an elegant prototype that closely resembled a Maserati Quattroporte. Naturally, it never made it to mass production. However, in 1980, FAW did manage to launch a new production model. Though unexpectedly, it was a small 19-seater bus. This vehicle wasn't intended for mass public transport. Instead, it was primarily used by hotels, travel agencies, and government organizations, essentially functioning as a mobile office. A similar approach had been seen in the USSR, where the ZIL plant built the Unost minibuses based on government limousines. Unost turned out to be more elegant compared to the Chinese version, which looked more like an ordinary city bus. In 1984, the company developed the CA750F, based on the midsize CA750 sedan. It became the first Chinese front-wheel drive sedan, but once again, it remained only a prototype. By the late 1980s, Hongqi's production had declined sharply, and that was inevitable. As China began opening its market to foreign automakers, demand for outdated domestic luxury cars dropped significantly. For the rest of the 1980s and into the mid-1990s, Hongqi was essentially limited to hand-building, heavily modified versions of its old CA770 sedan. But it would be wrong to say the company was just sitting idle. There was a clear understanding that China still lacked the resources to develop a modern car entirely on its own. So cooperation was the only viable path forward. This time, however, they didn't turn to their old Soviet, or now Russian, partners. The Russian auto industry was going through its own crisis and simply wasn't in a position to offer any help. Instead, salvation was sought through cooperation with Audi and Lincoln. Under the Hongqi brand, they began producing rebadged foreign models. The German side even sold FAW a license to produce the Audi 100, which became the basis for thousands of official sedans and parade convertibles. The model proved to be incredibly successful and long-lived, so much so that with multiple facelifts and updates, it remained in production all the way until 2008. I still remember, back in the pre-internet days, seeing photos of what looked like a strange Chinese Audi 100 in magazines and wondering, is this a copy, a licensed build, or is Audi actually making cars in China? In many ways, that car became a symbol of the Chinese 1990s. But commercially, the picture was less optimistic. Most of these cars were allocated to government agencies, and private buyers remained cautious, preferring Japanese and European luxury sedans. Even symbolically, these rebadged cars failed to inspire. One glance at the Chinese Audi was enough to tell you it didn't match the presence or prestige of the now aging CA770. The Chinese Lincoln Town car fared even worse. Its 4.6-liter V8 didn't comply with China's new tax rules, and Ford had no viable alternative. Despite glowing reviews in state-run media, the Lincoln Hongqi barely caught on even within the government sector, let alone with private buyers. By 2005, the partnership between FAW and Ford had ended. A third attempt came in 2006, this time with Japan's Toyota. FAW launched the Hongqi HQ3, based on the Toyota Crown Majesta. Targeted at entrepreneurs and high-level officials, the HQ3 offered modern technology and high quality, but never gained traction against Western rivals. In fact, many automotive historians consider this entire era, from the late 80s to the mid-2000s, as a time when Hongqi had, in essence, ceased to exist. All those rebadged efforts were seen not as a rebirth, but as the brand's prolonged and painful death throes. You may agree or disagree with their ideology, but in one thing they were clearly wrong. Hongqi was not dead. A new chapter in the brand's history began in the late 2000s. FAW decided to revive the production of exclusive vehicles for the country's elite. The result was the HQE project, a retro-styled limousine with a V12 engine under the hood. And this time, the engine wasn't American. It was a fully homegrown Chinese development. Financially secure by that point, the company spared no expense. A whole lineup of sedans, limousines, and convertibles was developed, with different designs, technical setups, and levels of armor protection. The car paid homage to the iconic Hongqi model of the 1960s, which explains some of its design quirks, like small window openings. But certain features, like the oddly high-mounted body over the chassis and bright red brake calipers, raised eyebrows and defied easy explanation. Only 17 units of the HQE series were built, and all of them were used exclusively by China's top leadership. In 2016, Hongqi introduced the L5, a new flagship sedan that retained the retro design, but offered a much more refined and technically advanced compared to the 2009 model. That same year, Hongqi shifted its strategy. It was time to capitalize on its national prestige. Leveraging both in-house developments and licensed technologies from Japanese and German manufacturers, FAW launched a full premium lineup of sedans and SUVs. The crown jewel of this move? The L5 went on sale, a slightly simplified version of the state limo used by President Xi himself. If you happen to want one, you'll need just two things: the desire and $800,000. Then it's yours. A keen eye, however, will spot plenty of differences between the civilian L5 and the one used by Xi. The production version featured simplified rear doors, a shorter wheelbase, and less rear overhang. Under the hood, a turbocharged 4.0-liter V8 replaced the old naturally aspirated V12, and the 6-speed automatic gave way to an 8-speed one. Ironically, just as Hongqi began delivering L5s to private customers, President Xi quietly moved on to a different car. The new official state limo, the Hongqi N501, debuted in spring 2018. Chinese media speculated that the N501 shares a platform with the Audi A6L, though it retains the same V8 turbo engine from the L5. Gone is the retro styling. The N501 has a restrained modern look. You can only identify it as a Hongqi by its signature grille, iconic wheels, and the signature red flag badge. There's no rear quarter window, no elongated insert, but local journalists estimate its length at around 5.5 meters, similar to a Mercedes Maybach S-Class. Then, in 2022, Hongqi's flagship evolved again. The new N701 model took direct aim at the Maybach segment. Its long rear doors, prominent chrome strip, and dramatic aero-style wheels leave no doubt about its ambitions. Security is so tight around the N701 that almost no official photos exist. All known images have been taken abroad by foreign journalists. In fact, after President Xi's visit to Moscow, 2 camouflaged limos were seen being loaded onto a plane, bound for their secretive return home. Technical details? Unsurprisingly, none have been released. But Hongqi no longer limits itself to government limousines. The brand has entered the mass market. With the launch of the midsize H5 sedan in 2018 and the HS5 and HS7 crossovers in 2019, the brand's first models aimed at the general public, Hongqi experienced a surge in popularity. In just 3 years, its sales skyrocketed more than 20-fold, from 4,702 units in 2017 to over 100,000 in 2019. By 2024, Hongqi had sold a record 411,777 vehicles. Stories of cars from communist countries often end in a predictable and sad way, but not this time. Hongqi has become a true flagship of China's modern automotive industry. With luxury sedans, SUVs, and even electric vehicles, it now confidently competes with global premium brands. But the story of ZIS, the Soviet brand that later became ZIL and marked the beginning of Hongqi's journey, took a different turn. Unable to survive the turbulent times, ZIL was looted and dismantled for profit by new Russian capitalists and developers. In 2023, it would have celebrated its 100th anniversary. But the story of ZIL deserves its own episode, and we'll talk about it in one of the next videos.